Scripture lesson for this morning, as I mentioned to them, is all about folks who are in too deep, in over their heads. It comes from the Gospel of Mark, chapter 6, verses 14 through 29. King Herod heard of it because Jesus' name had become known. And some were saying of Jesus, John the Baptizer has been raised from the dead, and for this reason these powers are at work in him. But others said of Jesus, it is Elijah. And others said, it is a prophet, but one of the prophets of old. But when Herod heard it, he said, John, whom I beheaded, has been raised. For Herod himself had sent men who arrested John, bound him, and put him in prison on account of Herodias, his brother Philip's wife, because Herod had married her. And John had been telling Herod, it's not lawful for you to have your brother's wife. And so Herodias held a grudge against John and wanted to kill him. But she could not, for Herod feared John, knowing that John was a righteous and holy man, and he protected him. And when he heard him, he was greatly perplexed, and yet Herod liked to listen to him. But an opportunity came when Herod, on his birthday, gave a banquet for his courtiers and officers and for the leaders of Galilee. And when his daughter, Herodias, came in and danced, she pleased Herod and his guests. And the king said to the girl, ask me for whatever you wish, and I will give it to you, even half of my kingdom. She went out and said to her mother, what should I ask for? And her mother replied, the head of John the Baptizer. So immediately she rushed back to the king and requested, I want you to give me at once the head of John the Baptist on a platter. And the king was deeply grieved, yet, out of regard for his oaths and for the guests, he did not want to refuse her. So immediately the king sent a soldier of the guard with others to bring John's head. And he went and beheaded him in the prison, brought his head on a platter, and gave it to the girl. And then the girl gave it to her mother. When the disciples heard about this, they came and took John's body and laid it in a tomb. Here ends the lesson. May God transform understanding into action. Amen. One word or phrase or expression can sum up today's scripture lesson very simply. And that expression is, uh-oh. Because every single person in this morning's lesson gets in a little deeper than perhaps they expected. Even John, who gets in too deep for speaking his mind to Herod. But in order to really understand the tangled web of choices that these people make in our lesson today, it's really important to understand, first of all, who these people were, what their history with each other was, and why it might have been so significant beyond the small clues that the scripture gives us for these people to behave in this way. First of all, who was Herod? The thing about lineages and dynasties is that a lot of the names get recycled. For instance, you'll notice in this gospel, the daughter of Herodias is also referred to as Herodias. Yet in a different account, I think it's Luke's account actually, she's actually given a different name, Salome, which was her historic name, at least from what we know. She was a real person, just like Herod was a real person. But because of these repeating names, it can be easy and understandable for us to assume that this is the same Herod that slaughtered all the children of Bethlehem during the Nativity story. In actuality, this is not that Herod. This is one of his sons. And this is his son who, how can I put this nicely, is something of a schmuck. If his father was a schmuck, then so is Herod Antipas, which is this Herod's name. But at the same time, even though we clearly see that Herod had a very tenuous relationship with doing the right thing, there are some things about this Herod that you might want to know. For example, this Herod, you'll notice, is not called King Herod. In the Gospel of Matthew, his father is referred to as King Herod. And yet, only 20, 30 years or so down the line, the new Herod goes by a different name. He goes by Herod Antipas, sometimes jokingly referred to as King Herod, but his actual title is something called a tetrarch. That's complicated. Basically, here's what it boils down to. When Herod's father, Herod the Great, the king mentioned in the Gospel of Matthew, when he died, what happened? Well, the throne was thrown into turmoil. Because the Jews technically didn't rule themselves. They had a king, in this case, King Herod the Great, although the great part is often disputed by historians. There's a lot of division about Herod the Great. But nonetheless, he was still a king. But after he died, his sons, and frankly the Roman court, were so concerned about what might happen to the Jewish quarter of the Roman Empire's holdings. And so what did they do? Rather than concentrating all their power into a king like Herod the Great, they said, this time, we're going to put some checks and balances in place. So Herod Antipas, who we meet this morning, rather than being a king, is only a tetrarch, which just means ruler of the quarter. So already he's only a quarter as powerful as his late father. And he's clearly a little insecure, we might say, in that moment in front of his courtiers and all of the officials who were with him, when he makes this promise to Salome in his moment of desperation. What does he say? He says, I will give you up to half of my kingdom. Guess what, guys? He didn't have a kingdom to give. He's literally talking, just talking for the sake of talking. He's trying to make, like some men will often do when they're trying to impress, a woman or a partner that they're interested in courting, they got to show off a little. So he says, oh, your dance was so beautiful. Ask me for anything and I'll give you half of my kingdom. It's like, buddy, you're basically a glorified mayor at this point. You don't know what you're talking about. But nonetheless, the offer is extended, and then we switch perspectives from Herod Antipas to Salome, or in this particular case, Herodias. She bears the same name as her mother. That was kind of her formal title in the court. And so she runs out to her mother, who, as we already know, has a bit of a run-in with John the Baptist about this whole, you got divorced and remarried thing. And specifically, it's the guy's brother. I don't know, man. By the way, this wasn't a widow kind of situation. Historically, we know that this happened. We know that Herod Antipas was visiting his brother in Rome, his brother Philip, happened to meet Herodias while he was there, and wouldn't you know it, they fell in love. He was so impressed that the first thing he thought to himself is, I've got to divorce my own wife and marry this woman, and so that's exactly what he did. Although, ironically, and the scriptures don't tell us this, she would divorce him later and marry somebody else too, so he got his in the end. Right? That door swings both ways. At some point, they have gotten married. He has moved her into his palace of sorts, and yet John the Baptist, this preacher, this itinerant guy who's living out in the wilderness eating bugs and wild honey, somehow manages to hold an audience with the king. What is this grip that John the Baptist holds on Herod Antipas? Is it just guilt? Could be. The scriptures don't tell us for sure exactly why he's so fascinated by the message of John the Baptist, but we're literally treated in this moment, which, by the way, shows up as a flashback in Scripture. It's this kind of weird moment in which Mark stops talking about whatever he was talking about before and says, but enough about that, let me go back to this for a second. It's the only time he'll do this in Scripture, so there was enough of an important aside that he felt the need to break up the story and make sure we had all these details. And so he paints this picture of Herod, who has already locked John in a dungeon, visiting John on a daily basis to get some word of wisdom. There might be some guilt involved, but there's also something compelling there. What might it have been? The Herodian dynasty, meaning, this Herod the Tetrarch and his father, King Herod, had not really inherited the title of King of the Jews, even though that's what they were called. It was a title that had been given to them by the Romans, who essentially occupied all of the Jewish territories and said, okay, you belong to us now, but we're not going to call it an occupation because that's a really nasty word. We're not going to call it an occupation. We're going to say you're essentially one of our civil territories. And so we trust you as the king that we've appointed to essentially hold up the law and order and, of course, maintain good relations with Rome. Minor details. But to the people, Herod, and this is another thing the scripture doesn't tell us, Herod was, let's say, not pure blood. Herod's line, including his father, Herod the Great, actually came from Esau. You know the story of Jacob and Esau, and they fought in their mother's womb. And Jacob steals his brother Esau's birthright, runs away, has a dream of Jacob's ladder with angels descending and reascending, and says, surely God was in this place and I didn't know it. Jacob wrestles an angel, comes to grip with the very God of the universe, and is injured for it, but God spares his life and calls him Israel, one who wrestles with God. Meanwhile, Esau, the brother who is actually entitled to everything, gets nothing. And so all these years later, it's actually Esau's descendants who have inherited the kingship of Israel. Needless to say, Judaism, as partially an ethnic religion, had some concerns about the legitimacy of this king. Because again, he wasn't considered strictly Jewish until his whole family had converted a few generations before. And simply converting wasn't enough. You actually weren't allowed to marry a quote-unquote real Jew until your family had approved it after 4 generations of someone converting to Judaism. They were so afraid of distilling the bloodlines and watering everything down. And so Herod is not really a legitimate ruler. He's not even in some way Jewish in the same way that the others are. And yet John the Baptist calls him out for his actions. He doesn't call him out for his lack of pedigree. He doesn't call him out for his heritage. He calls him out for his behavior, which in some ways, I think, kind of validated Herod a little bit. He's like, wow, he's talking to me like I'm one of his people. Maybe I really am the ruler. And again, he sort of puffs himself up in a moment of insecurity. And we have this story of him repeatedly going to the dungeon where he's keeping John captive, trying to get him out of Herodias' way, and Herodias just keeps saying, kill him, kill him, kill him, until finally, using her own daughter, she manipulates the situation in a very creepy stepdad kind of way to get something out of Herod. And Herod realizes in front of all of these men that if he backs down now, he's going to look like a fool. In too deep. And so he reluctantly goes ahead with it and says, fine, I don't want to be there. I'm going to send someone to do my dirty work for me. But sure, I promised you anything. You want John the Baptist dead. Your mother's been harping on me about that for a while. Let's do it. And yet now, with this rise in the early church, Herod's thinking to himself, oh, John the Baptist has come back. His ghost has returned to haunt me. That thing I did a while ago to get out from under the thumb of the moral authorities has caught up with me. You can't run from the truth. Even being the most powerful man, at least in that general area, he might not have been a king, but he was still fairly powerful. He had the authority to lock someone up because he saw them as a threat, or have them executed just with the wave of a hand. He was powerful in his own way, but even with all that power, he gets in over his head. And he's so embarrassed, he doesn't know what to say except to go along with it. I also love this passage because in biblical times, in which women had even less agency than they have now in some cultures. In biblical times in which patriarchy was kind of the norm, and that was a given, and it wasn't a political thing, it was just the norm. It's so often in the scriptures to see women villainized. And with Herodias, the mother, it's very easy to see her as this kind of, seductive, dangerous, She's dragged Herod off the righteous path. She's pulling him away from John the Baptist, his teacher. It's so easy to see her as the bad guy. But then we have this picture of her daughter, who, like her mother, is a woman in a man's world and who is just trying to survive. And so she dances for her stepfather. And he says, I'll give you anything. And she doesn't even know what to ask. She is so manipulated and controlled and so much at the whim of the authorities around her that even in that moment, when he could not have backed down and said, I will give you my entire kingdom, this is a woman so controlled by someone else in her life that she has to go out of the room and ask what to ask for. With half of the kingdom's authority as a woman of all things, she could have done whatever she wanted. And Herod realized that she had him. But Salome goes to her mother and says, what do I ask? And her mother says, I have an idea. And yet, as we learn from history, it wasn't enough. Eventually, she leaves Herod and goes and does her own thing, eventually marries someone else who was also a ruler. And the whole family kind of hops around like that. If you look at the history of this dynasty, it's sort of everybody sort of being married to each other for a couple of years and sort of getting sick of each other, or someone trying to poison someone else, which often happened in royal families. And so at some point, they would just kind of switch off. So she kept going. It wasn't like by committing this horrible act and putting her daughter in this terrible position and putting Herod and John the Baptist in this terrible position. It's not like she made everything better. In too deep. But every moment at which these characters could have said, no, I'm sorry, I can't do that. Every moment at which they could have taken a moral stance, at which Herod could have said, no, I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to execute John. He fails to do so. At which Salome could have called for mercy of some kind. She fails to do so. In which Herodias could have realized the truth of what John was speaking and could have acted accordingly, and she doesn't. Nobody in this story does the right thing, except for perhaps John, and he gets killed for it. It's so easy, and it's very easy too with children, especially during the blessing of the children. It's so great to say, oh, it's nice to ask for help. Let's all ask for help if we need help. That's a good thing. It's a good lesson to teach children. But sometimes it's hard to ask for help. And sometimes when you ask for help, you may not get the help that you actually need. You may be opening yourself up in some vulnerable way to being exploited by someone else. And even the possibility that exists in the back of our minds that that could happen sometimes renders us immobile and makes it impossible for us to act as we know we should. In too deep. This is an interesting scripture lesson to read in the summer, especially because it is such a downer. Because it's just a flashback that tells a really depressing story and then moves on to something else. But I bring it up this morning because I feel like, particularly in a world in which all of our choices now are much more easily held into account, in which everything you do, particularly online, can be traced, in which everything we do in terms of our public persona, our public figure, can be analyzed to death, in which it can be so easy for someone who wasn't living our experience to tell us how we should have done things. It would have worked out if you had just done this. Might be true, not always easy. And as we see this morning, you can get to the point in which you feel so deep, so in over your head, that you just double down on the mistakes you've already made. Fixing that is where the humility comes in. And we learn humility through this scripture lesson by what not to do. Like much of the stories in the Jewish Bible, right? You look at the lives of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, the lives of the patriarchs, and you go, I don't know that these guys are so nice. Maybe the point is to learn what not to do. So I pose that to you this morning. Are there aspects of your life, and I don't know, I'm not wheedling into your mind this morning, trying to figure out which one of you I'm speaking to. At some point, I'm probably speaking to all of you, because I think we've all been there. I'm in over my head. I don't know how to ask for help. I don't know how to stand up for this thing that I feel like is right. Herod gets so close. Even the act of visiting John daily in the dungeon is something of an act of rebellion. I'm sure it raised eyebrows. But he doesn't commit. He backs away in the critical moment, and he allows himself to be taken advantage of. Just as everyone else in this story is using and abusing everyone else. What not to do. There are so many aspects of our lives. It's hard to keep track. And it's so easy to wake up one morning and realize, I'm in too deep. I don't know how to get out. And so my message to you this morning is actually fairly simple given all the context that I used to set it up, which is this. If you feel alone to the point where you can't make the choice that you feel like you should make or you need to make, ask for help. It seems simple, maybe too simple, but it's not meant to be condescending. It's just a realization that sometimes we need a powerful reminder to ask for help. And if we don't get the help we need the first time, to keep asking. Because what may happen as you realize over time, there's no one to fill that void. You may be the person called to offer that help to someone else in a critical juncture in which they also need it. That may be a learning experience for you. I don't pretend to know how God thinks. But I do know that sometimes when we think God is least present, we are being prepared in some way, either intentionally or unintentionally, for a way to serve others who go through the same thing later. And then when we see it again, we go, oh, I know what that is. I've been there. And rather than acting by exploiting someone's vulnerability, the compassion response kicks in. You're in too deep, brother. Let me help you out. You're in over your head, sister. Maybe I'll jump down in the hole with you so that you don't have to be alone. The role of the church is to find those of us, including ourselves, often ourselves most of all, who need to be reminded that we have a choice. Who need to be reminded of the power of our choices. Because we forget sometimes, as one person in a vast world, that our choices can reverberate through the centuries. And that one choice we make, like the choice we read about this morning, Herod's choice, can be passed down for 2,000 years. So that all of the people in this room, without knowing anything about Herod or his background, we all remember that one bad choice he made. That one terrible choice he made. The church becomes a place for us to air those feelings out, for us to lift one another up. And so, my friends, I say to you, if you're in too deep, that's okay. John the Baptist was in too deep. Jesus gets in over his head at one point. He even calls out to God, and God doesn't seem to answer. My God, why have you forsaken me? Being in over your head, being in too deep is just part of a life of faith. At some point, you'll face it. I'm sure you have already. But I remind you this morning, even when you are in too deep, even when you're in over your head, you have a choice. And if you need help to make it, if you need support and strength from someone else as you make the choice, you need only to ask.